Sir, you're under arrest for trespassing on HOA property.
I'm standing on my own driveway when the cop says this. My own driveway. On land my family has owned since 1978. Behind him, Delilah Thornfield, our neighborhood's self-appointed queen, crosses her arms smugly.
I warned you about those ugly solar panels, Adrian. Nobody wants to see that trash ruining our property values.
The officer looks uncomfortable but reaches for his handcuffs. Sir, she says you won't follow HOA rules.
HOA rules?
My jaw clenches.
Officer, I'm not even part of their HOA.
Everybody in Willowbrook Estates follows our rules. No exceptions, period.
The smell of hot asphalt rises between us as I reach into my back pocket for a piece of paper that's about to flip this whole script. What would you do if your neighbor tried to control property you don't even own? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how I got into this mess with Delilah Thornfield in the first place. My name's Adrian Whitmore, and I'm 52 years old. Spent 30 years as an electrician before my back finally said enough, and I took early retirement. Nothing fancy about me. I drive a 10-year-old pickup that smells like coffee and motor oil. My idea of fine dining is grilling burgers in the backyard, and I've never owned a tie that cost more than $20. The land I live on has been in my family since 1978, when my grandfather bought 47 acres of what used to be nothing but cornfields and coyote trails. Grandpa was one of those old-school farmers who believed in keeping what was his and staying out of other people's business. He built a modest farmhouse on the eastern edge of the property, where the smell of his pipe tobacco still seems to linger in the wooden beams. Fast forward to 2001. A developer comes knocking, wanting to buy most of Grandpa's land for a subdivision. Grandpa was getting old, needed the money for medical bills, but he wasn't stupid. Marcus, he told me, sitting on his porch that creaked with every word, never give away everything. Always keep something they need. He sold 38 acres, but kept the original farmhouse and, here's the important part, several key parcels scattered throughout what would become Willowbrook Estates. I inherited everything when Grandpa passed in 2003, including his advice about city folks. They'll take everything if you let them, but they'll respect you if you don't. Enter Delilah Thornfield in 2018. She moved to Willowbrook straight from some fancy suburb pharmaceutical sales manager with a BMW she washes twice a week and opinions about everything from mailbox colors to what kind of grass you should grow. The woman could probably find fault with a rainbow if it wasn't color coordinated with her shutters. Within 6 months, she was on the HOA board. Within a year, she was president. Now, I'd been living peacefully alongside my neighbors for 15 years. Never had a problem with anybody. I keep my property clean, help neighbors with electrical work, and if someone's dog gets loose, I'll walk it back home with a smile. But Delilah had different plans. It started with her little notebook, taking pictures of my workshop, a building that's been there since Carter was president. Too rustic for her taste. Then my vegetable garden became aesthetically concerning. The sound of my table saw on Saturday mornings was suddenly a noise violation. When I politely explained I wasn't part of their HOA, she didn't back down. She escalated, started telling neighbors I was uncooperative and dragging down property values. 3 families who'd waved for years suddenly looked the other way when I drove past. That's when I discovered her pattern. She'd already forced out the Venesags over their vegetable garden, made the Johnsons remove their kids' basketball hoop, and convinced the city to make the Ramirez family tear down a perfectly legal fence. The woman was a professional bully with a HOA badge. But last month, when I installed solar panels on my roof to cut my electric bill, Delilah lost her mind. Marched over with her covenant book like she was carrying the 10 Commandments, demanding I get architectural approval for my own damn house. Every structure modification requires board review, she announced, standing in my driveway like she owned it. I'm not in your HOA, I told her. Her face went red. Everyone in Willowbrook Estates follows our rules, period. That's when she made her first big mistake. She filed a complaint with the county claiming I was operating a non-compliant residential structure. And that's when I decided to do a little research of my own. So there I was, sitting in the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning that smelled like stale coffee and decades of bureaucratic desperation, trying to figure out exactly what Delilah thought she could accomplish with her complaint. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Bernice who's worked there since dinosaurs roamed the earth, pulled up my property records with all the enthusiasm of someone doing their 10,000th title search. Whitmore property, Willowbrook area, she muttered, squinting at her computer screen through glasses thick enough to start fires. Honey, you've got some interesting history here. That's when I learned something my electrician buddies had always told me about property deals. Read every single line of every single document, because developers love to hide things in the fine print. Turns out, when Grandpa sold that land back in 2001, he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. The developer bought 38 acres, sure. But Grandpa kept 9 strategic parcels scattered throughout what would become Willowbrook Estates. And according to these yellow documents that crackled when Bernice turned the pages, those parcels included some pretty important real estate. The community center where the HOA held their monthly power trips, built on my land. The playground where neighborhood kids spent their afternoons, also mine. That detention pond that kept the whole subdivision from turning into a lake every time Mother Nature sneezed. Sitting pretty on property that belonged to me. But here's where I nearly spit coffee all over Bernice's desk. The community mailbox cluster where everyone picked up their Amazon packages was also on my land. Every single day, 34 households trespassed across my property to get their mail, and they had no idea. Can you print all of this? I asked. Honey, at my age, I've seen every kind of property dispute you can imagine. But this? She gestured at the screen. This is about to get entertaining. My phone rang before I even made it to my truck. Delilah's number flashed on the screen like a warning signal. Marcus, I've organized a petition, she announced without so much as a hello. Her voice carried that special brand of smugness reserved for people who think they're about to win an argument. 23 households have signed a formal request for the county to force you into HOA compliance. I looked down at the survey maps in my hands, showing property lines that made her petition about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Is that right? The county needs to understand that your non-compliance threatens our insurance rates and property values. We have standards here and you will follow them. The irony was so thick I could have bottled it and sold it as syrup. Delilah, can I ask you something? What? Her tone suggested she was already regretting answering her phone. When you walk to the mailbox every morning to get your pharmaceutical samples and complaint letters from other HOAs, do you ever wonder who actually owns the ground under your feet? That's common area, obviously. The developer set it aside for community use. Right. And the community center where you practice your dictatorship skills? Also common area. What's your point, Adrian? Here's where I made my first tactical decision. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to let them think they're winning while you quietly gather ammunition. Just curious about property lines, that's all. You know how us country folk are about knowing where our boundaries are. Well, you can be curious all you want, but you're still going to follow our rules or face the consequences. Click. She hung up on me like I was some kind of telemarketer. 3 days later, Delilah's petition landed on the county clerk's desk with all the legal weight of a paper airplane. 23 signatures demanding that Adrian Whitmore be forced to comply with established community standards and submit to HOA jurisdiction for the good of neighborhood property values. Poor Delilah. She'd just filed a formal government complaint demanding that a property owner get permission from people who were essentially squatters to modify his own land. But I wasn't ready to drop this bombshell yet. Instead, I called a professional surveyor. When Pete showed up with his GPS equipment and bag of bright orange flags, Delilah appeared at her window like she had some kind of measuring device radar. She watched him work for 3 hours, probably wondering why anyone would pay for a survey just to install some solar panels. Pete walked every inch of my property with the precision of someone who'd been doing this since surveying involved actual chains and compasses. When he finished, orange flags dotted Willowbrook Estates like confetti after a very specific kind of celebration. Your grandfather was either brilliant or lucky, Pete told me, packing up his equipment. Most developers would have demanded those key parcels as part of the sale. He kept all the spots that make a community actually function. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cold beer, looking out at all those orange flags marking my territory, and started planning phase 2 of what was about to become Delilah's very expensive education in property law. Delilah's next move came exactly 1 week later, and it proved she was either completely delusional or preparing for a career in professional overreach. I was in my workshop sanding down a cabinet for Mrs. Vanessa, the same neighbor Delilah had terrorized about her ethnic plants, when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window dusted with sawdust that caught the afternoon light like glitter, I could see my nephew Jake's Honda Civic parked next to my truck. Walking toward him with the confidence of a federal marshal was Delilah, clipboard in hand, slapping what looked like a parking ticket under his windshield wiper. I stepped outside, still holding my sandpaper that felt rough as Delilah's personality. "Something wrong here?" She turned with that smile people use when they think they've checkmated you in chess. "Your nephew is in violation of visitor parking regulations. Section 4.7 clearly states guests must use designated visitor spaces only." Jake looked at me like someone had just announced the moon was made of cheese. "Uncle Adrian, I'm parked in your driveway." "Exactly the problem," Delilah continued, consulting her clipboard like it was the Constitution. "All parking within Willowbrook Estates must conform to community standards for aesthetic and safety compliance." Now, 30 years of electrical work teaches you about people who think they have authority they don't actually possess. I once had a homeowner try to tell me the National Electric Code didn't apply to his house because he disagreed with government overreach. Same energy, different delusion. Instead of arguing, I pulled out my phone and started recording. "So you're claiming legal authority to issue parking citations on my private property?" "On community property subject to HOA oversight, absolutely." "And my driveway is community property, how exactly?" "All residential areas within our subdivision boundaries fall under community jurisdiction for maintaining property values and neighborhood standards." The woman was basically claiming eminent domain over my driveway with the legal backing of a book club. After Delilah left, strutting back to her BMW like she'd just solved world hunger, I made a decision that would pay dividends for months. I installed security cameras around my property. Nothing fancy, just basic systems that would document exactly what was happening on my land. The footage from the first week was more entertaining than anything on Netflix. Night 1. Delilah dumping yard waste at my property line around 11 p.m., clearly operating under the cover of darkness like some kind of suburban garbage ninja. Night 3. Her husband using my land to turn around their landscaping trailer, leaving tire tracks in my grass like he owned the place. Night 5. Delilah herself creeping through my vegetable garden with a measuring tape, probably calculating how many property value points my tomatoes were costing the neighborhood. But Night 7 gave me footage that was absolutely priceless. I caught Delilah red-handed, literally, painting survey stakes. See, those orange flags Pete had placed to mark my property boundaries were apparently cramping her style. So there she was at 10:30 p.m. with a can of green spray paint, changing my bright orange property markers to match the grass. The woman was literally trying to erase my property lines. The next morning, I timed my walk to the mailbox perfectly, arriving just as Delilah was collecting her daily stack of pharmaceutical samples and neighborhood complaint forms. The air smelled like Mrs. Vanessa's honeysuckle, the same plants Delilah had tried to ban, as I approached what she still thought was community property. "Morning, Delilah. Sleep well?" She turned around with the expression of someone who'd been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. "I'm busy, Adrian." "I bet you are. Hey, quick question. Do you know what tampering with legal survey markers is called?" Her face went whiter than fresh paint. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot from my security footage. There she was, clear as day, spray painting my property stakes in the middle of the night like some kind of suburban vandal. In most states, altering survey markers is a felony. Something about interfering with legal property boundaries. Funny how that works. She grabbed her mail with hands that were definitely trembling. "You're harassing residents of this community. I'm filing a restraining order." Against a man checking his mailbox on his own property? Good luck with that. As she stormed off, I realized Delilah had just made her biggest mistake yet. She'd escalated from annoying neighbor to actual criminal activity, and she'd done it all on camera. That afternoon, I made copies of everything and scheduled a meeting with a property attorney. Because if Delilah wanted to play legal games, I was about to show her what real legal authority looked like. Delilah's third escalation came 2 weeks later, and this time she'd clearly been burning the midnight oil studying local ordinances like she was cramming for the bar exam. I was up on a ladder in the Johnsons' living room replacing a ceiling fan that hummed like an angry wasp when my phone rang. The caller ID showed County Code Enforcement. Never words you want to see on a Thursday morning. "Mr. Whitmore? This is Inspector Williams. We've received a formal complaint alleging unauthorized commercial activity at your residential address." I climbed down the ladder, wiping my hands on a rag that reeked of electrical paste and 30 years of honest work. Through the Johnsons' window, I could see Delilah standing in her driveway, pretending to water plants while obviously straining to hear my conversation. Commercial activity? The complaint states you're operating an unlicensed electrical contracting business from your home, conducting commercial operations in direct violation of residential zoning codes. The woman had done her homework this time. She'd figured out that I occasionally helped neighbors with electrical problems, installing outlets, fixing switches, basic maintenance I'd been doing since retirement, and she'd turned my good neighborliness into a weapon against me. Inspector, I help friends with electrical issues. No charge, no business license needed, just neighbors helping neighbors. I understand, sir, but we're required to investigate all complaints. Can you meet me at your property tomorrow at 2 p.m.? After hanging up, I sat in the Johnsons' kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee and maple syrup from their kids' breakfast, and started laughing. Because while Delilah had been busy weaponizing county bureaucracy against me, I'd been doing some research of my own. My old foreman, Big Jim, taught me something valuable during a permit dispute back in '98. Marcus, he said, chomping on a cigar that could have been classified as a chemical weapon, when you're fighting City Hall, make City Hall fight itself. Government keeps records of everything, you just gotta know what to ask for. So I'd filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all public records related to the Willowbrook Estates HOA. Property tax assessments, business licenses, financial filings, the whole paper trail that bureaucrats love to generate. The files arrived in a manila envelope thick enough to stop bullets. For 15 years, the Willowbrook Estates HOA had spent exactly $847,000 on what they called community improvements and maintenance. Pool renovations that cost more than my truck, playground equipment fancier than most schools, landscaping bills that could feed a small country. But here's where it got interesting. Every single improvement had been made to facilities sitting on my land. The community center they'd renovated 3 times with granite countertops and hardwood floors, built on property I owned. That playground equipment they'd installed last spring, the kind with safety surfaces that cost more per square foot than my kitchen flooring, anchored in dirt that belonged to me. The basketball court they'd resurfaced twice, complete with professional-grade hoops, located on land I'd inherited from Grandpa. Even better, buried in the insurance paperwork like a time bomb waiting to explode, I found something that made my morning coffee taste like victory. For 15 years, the HOA had been paying liability insurance, utilities, and maintenance costs for commercial facilities on land they didn't own, didn't lease, and had no legal right to use. They'd been operating under the assumption that the original developer had secured permanent easements for community use. Turns out, assumptions and legal reality are about as compatible as cats and vacuum cleaners. When Inspector Williams showed up the next day, a guy who looked like he'd investigated every possible neighbor dispute known to mankind, I was ready with my own paperwork. Mr. Whitmore, I need to examine this commercial activity complaint. Absolutely, but while you're here, maybe you can help me understand something about commercial zoning violations. I handed him copies of my property deeds and the HOA financial records. If someone builds commercial facilities on your private property without permission and charges people money to use them, what would you call that? He studied the documents while his expression shifted from bureaucratic boredom to genuine fascination. Well, that would be unauthorized commercial use of private property, depending on the revenue involved, possibly commercial conversion without owner consent. And if they've been collecting dues from residents specifically to fund these operations, that could constitute running a commercial enterprise on private land without proper permits or owner authorization. He looked up from the papers. Mr. Whitmore, how long has this been happening? 15 years. Nearly $1 million in improvements and operating costs. All on land they have no legal right to use. Inspector Williams let out a whistle that could have called dogs from 3 counties over. Sir, I think you need to consult with an attorney before this goes any further. After he left, having found zero evidence of any commercial activity on my part, I realized that Delilah had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. She'd tried to get me in trouble for helping neighbors, while unknowingly exposing her own organization's massive, unauthorized commercial operation on my property. Time to call a lawyer and see exactly how expensive Delilah's power trip was about to become. That weekend, I was digging through Grandpa's old papers in the attic, a dusty space that smelled like mothballs and decades of forgotten Christmas decorations, when I found something that flipped this entire situation on its head. Buried in a shoebox underneath his discharge papers from Korea and a stack of seed catalogs that probably predated the internet, there was a manila folder labeled Willowbrook Development, important, in Grandpa's careful handwriting that looked like it had been carved with a chisel. Inside was the original development agreement from 2001. Not the simplified summary the county had on file, but the complete contract with all its legal addendums and fine print that would make a lawyer weep with joy. I spread the papers across my kitchen table under the same lamp that Grandpa used to read his evening paper. And what I discovered made me understand why he'd always said, "Never give